For a number of years, I worked at the University of Kentucky as their vegetable extension specialist. Then came back to UGA, where I was based on our Tifton campus. And in Tifton, I was the commercial specialist for the state. And so all the big vegetable farms in South Georgia, I handled pretty much any commercial vegetable crop that we grow. And this first picture is actually a picture of one of my trials down in Tifton, looking at cantaloupes and specialty melons. A couple of years ago, I moved back up to Athens, where I took over a faculty position in organic vegetables with a higher teaching split. And then very shortly after that, I was asked to do hemp production for UGA. And even though my job is actually organic production, I've been doing hemp. It's been 95% of my time for the past year and a half. So there's that. But I wanted to, so since everyone on here is in education, I structured this a little bit different than kind of my typical Master Gardener talk. I've got a little bit more background in terms of the vegetable industry in Georgia and the United States, because I thought it might be more helpful to bring some of these things into classes when you can, when the opportunity presents itself. And so I'm going to cover a little bit more about the industry. And then when I go through the crops, normally I have things that are very catered to folks with large areas to cultivate, but I've catered it a little bit more to an educational setting for today. So a little bit about veggies. There is a little bit of debate regarding whether or not we consider potatoes vegetables or agronomic crops. I consider them veggies. And so if we did, potatoes would kind of blow away everything else in terms of per capita consumption, with of course most of that being processed. Followed by tomatoes, lettuce, and sweet corn and onions. A lot of people don't necessarily think we eat that many onions, but they're in a lot of different products that we consume. And so, with that said, the bulk of most of the vegetables that we consume are processed, except for lettuce, of course, being in salad, and sweet corn is kind of mixed. In terms of production, a lot of folks don't realize that China kind of blows the doors off every other country in terms of vegetable production. In China, most of the farms tend to be smaller, but there's an awful lot of them, and production is very, very intense, particularly centered around the big urban areas. And I'll cover a little bit of this late in the talk. But the United States is ranked third. Some of the other countries you may not necessarily think of as being kind of veggie powerhouses. Turkey, with the Mediterranean climate, and Egypt, and so on, are fairly large producers. A lot of the production in those countries is for export to the EU. I did some work in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria through USAID. And the vast majority of the large-scale operations in those countries were for export to EU, and so on. But the United States is third. Got a ways to go to ever reach China. Of course, China with over 1.5 billion people. Vegetables are very perishable, and so most, unless you're going relatively short distances, like across the Mediterranean, most veggies are going to be produced in the home country. Like I said, leading veggies worldwide, cassava, when it's consumed as a root, it's classified by the UN as a vegetable. I wouldn't really classify it as that. It's not grown like a vegetable for the most part. It's not as perishable. Tomatoes, sweet potatoes, they're one of the top vegetables in the world. It makes sense. They store very well. China produces by far the most sweet potatoes in the world. Interestingly, a lot of the sweet potatoes produced in China are actually fed to to swine, used as an animal feed. A number of years ago, UGA actually had a faculty member. His name was Stanley Kays, and he was working on a white, unsweet sweet potato. And actually, one of his claims to fame was, I think it was Jay Leno, or used to do like the stupid headlines in the Late Show. And Stanley actually made it to a newspaper one time for developing an unsweet sweet potato, and which a lot of people thought was ridiculous. But the whole idea behind that was that sweet potato, most staple crops are relatively bland and store very well. And so his idea was that if he could produce a white, relatively unsweet sweet potato, that it could be used as a staple crop. Regular Irish potatoes, as they're called, don't grow particularly well in tropical areas, but sweet potatoes do. And his whole idea behind that was to develop a sweet potato that could be used as a staple crop in tropical areas, and help alleviate hunger in parts of the world. So that's the story behind that. Watermelons weigh a lot, so they're fairly high up there. And then cabbage. Actually, China, number one veggie in China is cabbage, but because a head of cabbage doesn't weigh as much as other things in terms of weight, it's not necessarily a leader. Like I said before, potatoes would be number one in the US if we included them, but in terms of fresh veggies, lettuce and sweet corn are kind of neck and neck in terms of acreage, followed by onions, watermelons, and then broccoli and tomatoes. A lot of people don't necessarily think of broccoli as being that popular, especially compared to the other ones, but broccoli takes up a lot of space. And so because of that, we do have a considerable amount of acreage devoted to that. So in the United States, our value is about $11 billion in terms of vegetables. And so just to put that in perspective, with that $11 billion, it's about 2 million acres of veggies. Contrast that to something like field corn grown in the Midwest. There's over 90 million acres. But the value of that crop is only about 3 times of what veggies are. So obviously, far less value per acre. And the same thing with cotton and soybean and so on. In fact, in Georgia, vegetables are worth about $1.1 billion to the state economy. The vast majority of that is obviously in South Georgia. And we have about 175,000 acres. In Georgia, in terms of cotton, we have about 1.2 million acres, and that's worth roughly what our vegetable crops are worth. So veggies are worth considerably more per acre. A lot of that has to do with the harvest labor that's used and the extremely high input costs that they have. Obviously in America, this is a little bit older census, so a little bit has shifted, but the dark green areas indicate areas of high vegetable production. And so obviously California leads the country in vegetable production, particularly with the Central Valley going to the Imperial Valley South. But there's some areas on here that you may not think of necessarily in terms of intensive vegetable production. And a lot of those are in the upper Midwest. Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin have a lot of veggie production, but the majority of that is for processing. Michigan produces most of the pickles in the United States, a lot of cucumber acreage. Wisconsin and Minnesota, there's a tremendous amount of sweet corn acreage and peas as well. And so those acres actually far outstrip vegetable acreage in the upper Midwest, but you just don't hear a lot about them. Most of the time, if you grow processing vegetables, they are located fairly close to a processing facility because of transport costs are prohibitive. And a lot of those processing facilities were developed in the northern United States. This is dating back even to the 1800s. And so they still kind of have a foothold in that part of the country. And of course, most of the fresh vegetable production is in the West and the southern United States, so on. Georgia, this is actually, a lot of people don't realize this, but typically we are, this is a little bit old, but we are generally third or fourth in terms of fresh vegetables harvested in the United States. Arizona has picked up a little bit recently. New York has fallen off a little bit, but typically we're in that third or fourth position. So in the months of May through June, pretty much anything shipped through the eastern United States comes out of North Florida or Georgia. And then we actually have a window in the fall for fresh vegetable production as well. And so it is very significant. You know, I went to school in Athens and spent a long time up in North Georgia, and never had an appreciation for how large the industry is until you get down to the southern part of the state, and it's quite significant. Like I said, we're over $1 billion in farm gate value. Our economic impact is over $2 billion in the state, and we are ranked fourth nationally typically. In the vegetable industry, there's about 15,000 people employed that are on the books. Of course, the vast majority of those individuals are labor in the field. One of our large farms in Tifton that I used to work a lot with has 700 employees, actually. So tremendous amount of hand labor involved. Almost any fresh vegetable that is bought is harvested by hand, planted by hand, and handled many times. And even in some cases, there are crews that will hand weed large fields if weeds get out of hand. And so that farm with 700 employees does about 6,500 acres of vegetable production, and they keep their crew busy almost all year round. And so a lot of labor involved in it. It's not a particularly fun job at all, but if people want to eat, that's how it's done. Just a little bit, I thought this might be helpful in terms of if you are discussing things with students, kind of where some of the vegetable areas of the state are. So I've got a few different areas that I've got blocked off, and I was going to discuss them very briefly. In Northeast Georgia, particularly into Rabun County, there is some significant production with cabbage and tomato production. A lot of times, if anyone has gone up 441, if you're driving up into North Carolina up there, you'll drive by Osage Farms, and that's the James family. They're actually responsible for the vast majority of the large commercial acreage up there, but they supply significant wholesale acreage of tomatoes and cabbage and some sweet corn. The rest of our large commercial production is in the southern part of the state. On the right-hand and southeast Georgia, Toombs and Tatnall County, they are the majority of our onion production in the state. It's about 90% of Vidalia onions are grown in those two counties, although there are about 20 counties where you can grow Vidalias. That industry is worth about $150 million to the state. Then you'll see that kind of pink area. That's our watermelon acreage. Watermelon, in terms of vegetables, are probably the most spread out in terms of production. They stretch from Dooley County, which is Vienna, Georgia, south more or less down to Cook County. And so most of that acreage is concentrated along I-75 with most of the packing houses. But Georgia is typically second or third nationally in watermelon production. The market from Memorial Day to July 4th is more or less supplied nationally by Georgia. And more or less, Georgia, because we have a concentrated spring market, we grow more watermelons in a more concentrated area than just about any other place in the world for that matter. And so the watermelon market after July 4th, prices drop dramatically. And so it no longer becomes cost effective to ship them for the most part out of Georgia. And so then acreage moves north to Indiana, is one of the other late production regions in the U.S. But typically, watermelon farmers, next time you go, if you buy a watermelon at the store, it costs about 9.5 cents a pound to produce a melon and put it in a box and ship it. And so most farmers around Memorial Day, you would get 20 to 22 cents a pound for a 45 count melon, which is what you see in the grocery stores, typically about a 14 to 15 pound melon. And then that price drops precipitously until the 4th of July, where it usually reaches about 10 or 11 cents a pound. And at that point, you just don't make any money shipping. So even though they could probably harvest more melons, they just walk away from the field at that point. So that's watermelon acreage. Over near Americus, there's a lot of snap beans. Fresh snap beans are grown there. And then in the far southwest part of the state, in Decatur and Mitchell County, I have a yellow outline. That's where sweet corn is grown. And we're probably second behind Florida in terms of fresh sweet corn produced in the United States. And that's actually our #1 vegetable in terms of dollars. And sweet corn is very interesting. It's actually, even though there are mechanical harvesters, it's all harvested by hand here in Georgia. And that's because growers are very concerned about bruising and quality. And so every single bit of that is hand harvested. And so that was actually a real big concern. Our sweet corn season starts kind of early. And with the COVID outbreak, they were very concerned about getting crews into the state. And then you'll see there's a couple of areas in green that are outlined in the southern part of the state, Tift, Colquitt, Brooks County, and then over into Eccles County. And that's kind of our mixed vegetable production, where our farm might have 10 or 12 different vegetables, whether it's peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, what have you. That's kind of the center of very diversified production. In Eccles County, it's one of the least populated counties in the state, and it's actually usually #2 in terms of vegetable value. There's some enormous farms down there, and for a little while, the Gates Foundation actually owned one of our big vegetable farms. Since it's sold out to Grimway Carrots, but they had about 10,000 acres of production in Eccles County. There's not a lot of reason typically to drive through Eccles County. So if you're ever driving to Florida, you'll pass it, and it's a big vegetable hotbed for us. I said sweet corn's our #1 veggie, followed by onions and watermelon, bell pepper, and then cabbage. And there's a bunch in that $60 million range. But sweet corn, you may not think of it, it does generate a lot of revenue for the state. 10 years ago, sweet corn was probably ranked #7th or 8th. But as land prices have increased in South Florida, a lot of that production has shifted into Georgia, where land prices are substantially cheaper. And of course, Vidalia onions, being as popular as they are worth quite a bit of money.
Tim, on the watermelon, what percentage of it would be seeded versus unseeded?
So for seedless melons are probably 95 to 98% of the acreage. And if you see people selling seeded melons on the side of the road or something like that, a lot of our farmers will you have to use seeded melons to pollinize triploid or seedless melons. And so typically we plant a non-harvestable pollinizer. It's really small. It's about softball size, and you can just ignore them. You walk through the field. Some acreage will be planted with a harvestable traditional seeded melon, and then a lot of times what happens is they're called pin hookers. Basically will show up, give the farmer, a few $100 cash, and they can go in and pick, a trailer load of melons. And then typically they'll drive up north, and then sell them. And so yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's all cash. And so growers will usually plant a handful of acres with the seeded harvestable pollinizers. And it's a way just to get a little bit of extra vacation money or something, typically, for the year. But I used to do variety trials every year, and by and large, there's none of the new commercial stuff. It's all seedless.
I do have another question, and that's what farm gate value means.
So farm gate value is the return that actually comes to the farmer. And so, if you looked at the farm receipts, sweet corn, that would be $158 million back to the farmer. And then of course, that value escalates when you go to a shipper and then, of course, retail. And so, if you actually looked at the retail value of this, watermelon might be worth $600 million in terms of retail value or more. And so this is just what the farmer gets in receipts, essentially.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And so talking about value, in terms of veggies, they are worth a tremendous amount of money compared to your traditional crops like cotton or peanuts. And so tomatoes have an average value of about $15,000 an acre. In a good year, could be worth $30,000 an acre. One thing with vegetables that I did want to point out is that the price is very fluid. And so a farmer could go from making, $4,000 or $5,000 in revenue an acre 1 week, and 10 days later be not making any money at all. And so it's very up and down. It's very hard to plan. And so most of our farms that are successful are highly diversified. And so one of the farmers outside of Tifton mentioned to me, they grow about a dozen different crops. And they said in a given year, they'll probably break even on about 8 of those. They might lose money on 2 or 3, but they hope to hit a home run on 1 or 2 of those crops. And that home run that they hit will then carry them through to the next year. Of course, you never know what crop it may be. And it's unfortunately in vegetables, if you hit a home run, it's usually dependent upon somebody else having significant losses. And so, for example, if in the fall, 2 years ago, we had Hurricane Michael, and Hurricane Michael pretty much wiped out vegetable production west of I-75. But there were some farms east of I-75 with peppers, for example, and the value of them skyrocketed after all the loss. And so some of those growers cleared several $1 million on their fall crop in terms of profit. And it just because they were spared from this hurricane. And so unfortunately, that's the way veggies are. There's no subsidies for veggies. And so as with many other industries, we've seen the vegetable industry consolidate, where you have to have a lot of capital and you have to be pretty large to be both diversified and to be able to weather 2 or 3 years of losses. And so it's incredibly difficult for new farmers to get into it because you may not make money for several years and you need to have several million in the bank to be able to tolerate losses for that time. So it's unfortunately that's the way a lot of things are going. I was just going to cover for a couple minutes some of the trends and so forth in the industry. Of course, immigration labor, because veggies are handled so much, that's by far the #1 issue that we deal with in vegetable production. The other, food safety, Modernization Act. I think it would be really interesting to actually do a food safety course, just to show in the United States, when you are third-party audited and certified through a food safety auditor, how many rules and regulations you have to go through to protect the food. And essentially, most of our growers, they're very sophisticated operations. If there was a problem with a particular box of peppers in New York City, and as long as that barcode on that box of peppers were able to be scanned, what field that box was picked in, who picked it, and when it was packed would be able to be pulled up in about 10 minutes. Everything is barcoded, that's sent out and shipped. All the packing crews, that's all connected to that, all the records. And so in terms of food safety on the vegetable side of things, because there is no tolerance for any bad things to happen, really. If you're a farm and you have a recall, you're going to go out of business. So food safety standards are very stringent. And so that's been an issue. Kind of the local food scene has also been a different issue, and then diversification, as I mentioned. I said food safety, in 2011, the Food Safety Modernization Act came into play. It really just took effect about 2 years ago, where food safety is now monitored by the FDA instead of USDA. But realistically, most of our growers are way ahead of the curve on this. Most of the big farms have a food safety specialist on staff to monitor food safety. Although I will say, I threw a little picture of a cantaloupe in here, and this is one of the things. Georgia used to be a leader in cantaloupe production, and we still do supply a lot of eastern melons. But even in the last decade, our production has probably dropped 65% as cantaloupe overall production has been cut because of some of the food safety concerns with it. And realistically, now we have about 8 cantaloupe growers left in the state. And those are the only growers that have the capacity to have the food safety means in place. No small grower is going to be able to really grow and sell cantaloupes wholesale anymore.
So do small farmers have to follow the FSMA?
Technically, they do not. And so there is, well, they should. It's recommended. But if you sell below $25,000 in produce, it doesn't cover you at all. And to be perfectly honest, in terms of federal regulation, it would take years for FDA to actually inspect all of these farms. So realistically, most of this food safety regulation is done by third parties. So if you want to sell to Walmart, for example, they require you to have a third-party food safety audit system in place. And that's actually more stringent than FDA. And so if you want to sell anything, you have to be inspected by a private third-party audit and so on. And so, and it's quite expensive. And so that system is actually a little bit more rigorous because real small farms, people that sell at the farmers market, don't have the resources to be able to do that. They just have recommendations. But to be truthful, they'll never be inspected. There's just not enough people to do the inspections. But anything that you buy in a grocery store would fall under this.
And what was the safety issue with the cantaloupes?
So a number of years ago, there was a case out of Colorado, out of Rocky Ford, with cantaloupes where there was a listeria outbreak. And the problem with cantaloupes is that kind of the rod, the netting on it, will, if there's any pathogens, human pathogens, out in the field in irrigation water, once that netting is formed, if those pathogens get trapped in that netting, they're almost impossible to get out. I mean, you can't actually get them out. And so out west, where they have very little rainfall, and very little dirt will splash onto the melons because of that. Most of the acreage has shifted out there. In the southeast, the eastern melons we grow, like the Athena melons you might see at the store, they tend to have a lot of netting on them. And because we get frequent rainfall, there's not much we can do about soil being splashed onto a melon. And so we do have some limited grows for melons. Interestingly, when melons are harvested, they're put on a wagon and they actually have like a swimming pool that they're dumped into. And they get floated through this pool that's full of bleach to kill hopefully anything on the outside of it. But it's kind of an impressive operation. But if you don't have the resources to put in those types of systems, no one's going to buy from you. So, but that's been one of the more high profile issues or cantaloupes. Another thing I mentioned, diversification. Most savvy farms are diversified now. Of course, there's a move for local food and of course spreading the risk. We did pick up some significant acreage when California went through that really bad drought a few years ago. And so Georgia is fortunate to have the Florida aquifer that our farms draw from. And so we do have abundant water. And so we did pick up some acreage from large scale farms hoping to diversify their risk out of California. And so, like I said, the local food things, it spawned a growth of a lot of small farms, particularly around, Metro Atlanta or other metro regions. But our big farms are also buying into this. And so this is actually a picture of a kale field in Tifton. And that field actually does stretch all the way to the tree line. And so all of this kale is hand harvested and planted. And when the kale boom took off, Georgia is the #1 greens state. And we actually, for a while, were growing more kale than pretty much any other state in the country. And it's interesting because a lot of our farmers, I actually had one grower who's been growing kale for years and never actually tried it. And so just like, I grow 700 acres of it, but I've never eaten kale before. But a lot of those kind of hip food things will hit the large scale growers, usually 1 or 2 years after they hit the farmers markets. And so kale is now kind of passé and our acreage has dropped a little bit, but there's other things too that our growers are looking at. Things like broccoli. Most broccoli is from California, but we do grow probably more than any other state in the eastern US and Georgia, particularly in the fall. And then lettuce. We do have different types of lettuce that buyers want. And that's actually a plot that I had down in Tifton. Shipping, if you were to ship a box of lettuce from California to the Midwest, it costs about $7 or $8 per box to ship. And so if you can get that closer, obviously, the produce companies will make more money. The problem is that, as you well know, our weather in Georgia fluctuates tremendously. And so when you would grow lettuce in early spring, you could have days that are 85 degrees in South Georgia, and then 3 days later have a day that's, 42 degrees. And lettuce doesn't care for that sort of dramatic change in temperature. And so it's very hard for us to get the yields that they would in California. But again, diversification is something that our farmers are constantly looking at as a way to kind of spread their risk out. So that was kind of just an overall background of veggies that I don't normally cover that much, but I thought it might be helpful if you're talking about things in Georgia, some regional differences around the state. And so now I was going to jump into some of the basic management things. And I'm actually going to spend a little bit more time on raised beds, particularly if you are looking to do anything at a school site. It's usually a little bit easier to do raised beds. You said they're very good options in the sense that you don't need big equipment. You don't need a big tiller to break ground, especially on most school sites probably have terrible dirt because they would clear a large area. and scrape the soil down to the B layer, so you're not going to have good topsoil. So raised bed options are pretty good. I know David Burley at the U Garden does do some raised bed gardening classes actually for educators. And so you can use a potting mix that's easy enough to purchase or bring in. They do warm up pretty quickly. I would say the biggest negative is that they drain so well. And so that means that you have to constantly be watering raised beds. They don't have that additional water holding capacity that you would have in native soil. And then in the fall, they do cool down a little bit quickly because they typically are obviously raised above the soil line, so you don't get that ambient heat of the soil to keep them warm. Different types of raised beds. I threw some tires in there because a number of years ago, I had a gentleman who accrued like 35 giant tractor tires and spread them all over his property as a gift to his kids, that they would have something to grow in. I don't think they were particularly thrilled with this. Anyway, but you can use almost anything for a raised bed. The bottom right-hand side, you can see just a mounded up bed. And that'll work fairly well. Of course, then if you're doing it that way, you don't need any additional structural supports, but typically in a more urban or suburban environment, doing some raised bed gardening, particularly if it is educational, is a little bit easier to manage than trying to break soil with you need a big tiller. In some cases, you may need even a small tractor, and that's beyond the capacity of some folks. In terms of watering, overhead sprinklers are obviously the quickest and easiest way to water. They're not very efficient in terms of water use, and probably the one or the two big negatives is that with overhead sprinkling, because you water the whole area, you're watering all your weeds as well. And so it does contribute significantly to weed pressure. And then the other thing is that you're keeping your foliage wet and you're going to increase disease. And so realistically, we don't recommend overhead sprinklers except for direct seeded vegetables, where you do need uniform soil moisture to get that crop to germinate and emerge. Generally, we recommend drip irrigation, especially as a master gardener, whether you're doing it at home, school, or have you. You probably don't have access to all the fungicides and stuff, and you probably don't want to spray them that our large commercial operators have. And so anything culturally that you can do to reduce disease pressure, I think is very helpful and very important. So drip irrigation, I think, is probably preferred. It's a lot more efficient. You can reduce your weed pressure, particularly between row areas, dramatically. The one negative is that drip irrigation does require more management because you're constantly fixing holes, especially during the dry time of the year. Rodents love to chew through drip irrigation to get moisture and all the salts that are in it. And so that is a real limitation, that there's a lot more parts to it. You can't just hook up a hose and let it go. If you do want to do drip irrigation, there's a bunch of different things out there. You do need to have relatively clean water. So most people on municipal water is fine. You do need a handful of tools to make sure you can hook everything up. And it can add up. And there's some different things out there. A couple years ago, there was this product called the Rain Weave Irrigation Fabric. And it was basically like an irrigation cloth, or a ground cloth that had irrigation tubing actually sewn into it, and then you could cut little holes for your plants. And that was kind of interesting. The irrigation tubing didn't hold up as well as the ground cloth did, and so after a few years, I think people got a little frustrated with it. The other thing is that it's kind of hard to find drip irrigation resources. I think for small scale, These two companies I've had very good luck with. They've gotten much better over the years, both Berry Hill and then particularly Dripworks. They sell a lot of small quantities of things. Typically, drip irrigation tubing comes on a 7,000-foot roll, and that would last you for probably 100 years. And so Dripworks actually sells things in very approachable volumes, and they'll sell kits. And so if you are looking to do some drip irrigation, it's worth looking them up. I've always had, like I said, pretty good luck with them. In terms of weed control, one thing I would recommend beyond anything else actually is stale seed bedding. And this may have come up in some other talks in the Master Gardener program, but again, just to emphasize, so stale seed bedding basically is, when you turn your soil, whether it's with a tiller or what have you in the spring, you bring a bunch of weed seeds right up to the surface. And so typically the first rain you have, they'll all sprout. And the idea behind stale seed bedding is once you till your soil, when you do get that rainfall, if it works out, don't plant your crop yet. Let it get rained on, get a flush of weeds, and then you can either go through and lightly scuff the surface with a hoe to kill those weeds, or if you want, you could spray with Roundup or another herbicide. And then try not to till the soil again. And so the idea is that you brought all these weed seeds up, they germinated, you killed them, and then you plant your crop in there maybe 2 weeks later. And so that way, you're not going to get rid of all the weeds, but at least that initial flush you've dealt with. And it's a lot easier, obviously, to deal with it when there's no crop that you're growing in there. And so a lot of organic farms use stale seed bedding. We use it when we can at the research farm. It's a good practice if you have time. And you can use it for anything. If you're seeding your lawn, for example, you could do the same thing. And it helps keep out stuff like crabgrass and other things. The other thing I put in was solarization. And this actually, particularly with a raised bed scenario, works fairly well. And so basically all it is you're getting clear plastic, make sure there's a little bit of moisture under it, cover the soil with clear plastic. You do have to seal the edges. So if you're doing this in a garden situation, just put dirt around all the edges so the air doesn't escape. You'll get a flush of weeds underneath it, but if you do it, especially during this time of year or during midsummer, those weeds should bake out. And then if you pull that off of there several weeks later, it can reduce some of your weed pressure. The one negative, well, in a state like Georgia where we may have 3 days that are 90 degrees and sunny, and then we'll have 2 days that are cloudy in low 80s, solarization doesn't work as well as it does in a more arid environment. And so we found that typically you need to leave the plastic out there for about 4 weeks minimum for it to work real well, just because we don't have that consistent sunny weather to work. But solarization can also work for some diseases. I worked with an organic researcher that had a lot of problems with sclerotinia, which is a rot of lettuce and tomatoes. Sometimes if you have lettuce growing in your home garden, you'll see a white fungus at the base with these little, look like rat feces, almost these little black pellets around it. And solarization actually is pretty effective at killing off that inoculum in the soil. Typically, if that inoculum is deep in the soil, it doesn't survive very well. If it's near the surface, it gets enough air and oxygen where it can overwinter, or in some cases, go through the summer. If you solarize it, it's actually pretty effective at taking that out. In terms of weed control, I think scuffle hose are probably the one, if you're going to invest in one implement, scuffle hose, that's the picture in the middle, or stirrup hoe, are very effective because they do slice fairly shallowly under the surface. You can use them for stale seed bedding. Other things, a collinear hoe, you see on the right side there, that's for more in-row weed control. Honestly, a lot of times you're so careful not to hit your plants that it's almost faster to do it just pulling them by hand. And then wheel hose. The picture down there is from Johnny's seed. If you do have a larger area, I think wheel hose are worth looking at because you get a lot of different implements for them. The one caveat is they're super expensive. The ones that Johnny sells, they're very nice, but they're like $300 a piece. So, yeah, you may not want to spend $300 just on a tool for the garden. And of course, the grub hose and stuff, they're more used for taking out large things like thistle or Johnson grass, where you're going to have to disturb the soil. But those are a few things that you can use in terms of weed control, I think are very helpful in the home garden scenario. The other thing I did want to focus on is even if you can't chop out all your weeds, one thing that you could do as a fail-safe is just to mow them down. And the reason being is if you've spent all year working on chopping your weeds out and then you go away for a couple of weeks, anything that goes to seed is basically going to ruin all the progress you've made all year. And so typically if you took a square yard of soil, there's usually about 1,000 weed seeds in that square yard in an average field scenario. But about 50% of that is usually from the previous year. So if you can keep your area relatively weed free, like I said, even mow it before things go to seed, you can drastically reduce your weed pressure over time. And one other thing is a lot of those seeds are only viable for 1 or maybe 2 years. So if you can stay on it for a couple of years, you'll start noticing some dramatic changes. And then of course I put a picture of a pigweed in there, Palmer amaranth. One large pigweed can produce 500,000 seed. And so definitely when you see things like that, chop them out before they go to seed, if anything. That's actually a major problem we have in Georgia with some of the GMO cotton that's Roundup ready. We have resistance to Roundup in Palmer amaranth or pigweed. And so for a number of years, our farmers actually had to send crews out into fields, in cotton fields, to chop out female Palmer amaranth plants to reduce the weed seed bank. And the other thing, seed bank disturbance, like I mentioned in the previous slide, typically most seeds half-life of about a year. And so again, so as long as you can avoid seed rain, or basically that's for when weeds set seed, you can really help yourself out. Weed size to target, ideally, and I know this doesn't happen all the time, but ideally you would target them at the thread stage, and that's in the pictures there. You see the little weeds coming up. Typically most of the cultivation implements, if you can slice through the plants at that point, you don't have to get all the roots out. Because there won't be enough reserves to keep the plant alive. So if you can stay on them and get them when they're really small, of course, it takes time, that is a little bit easier. A lot of the cultivation techniques don't work very well if you've got a 6 or 8 inch tall weed. At that point, the roots are generally stout enough that they can resprout. So a little bit of other things during the season, insect pests, a couple things, removing hosts. Obviously, weeds are hosts for a lot of insects, getting old material out of the field. Biological controls. This is something if you've got particularly flowers nearby, a lot of the insects that exist on flower populations are actually predators. And so anything you can do to kind of enhance that environment for biological controls is very helpful. That's actually a lot of our larger, even conventional farms now are planting areas of buckwheat and other things near their crops to kind of bring in some of those predators. We actually have a faculty member who will measure insect gut contents. And so he goes out to the field and looks at all different spiders and stuff, and then he does PCR on them to find out what insects they're eating. And spiders actually are one of the best biological controls out there because they do eat a lot of insect pests. And then physical control. The top picture shows some row cover. And I did want to point out physical control as a way to keep insect pests out. And that top picture is actually a row of cantaloupes. And cantaloupes in the southeast, they get a disease called bacterial wilt. And so in that bottom middle picture, you can see some cantaloupes and all the leaves are all dead around them. So that's bacterial wilt, and that's actually spread by the striped and spotted cucumber beetles. So you can see the little cucumber beetle there on the bottom left. They carry the bacteria in their gut, and when they feed on the plant, their feces has the bacteria in it, and it gets into the plant. It takes about 3 weeks, and then that suddenly, if you've got a cucumber or cantaloupe, it'll suddenly wilt and die. And so one of the ways, without using insecticides, that you can help reduce this is by physically excluding the beetles from the plants. And so that's what we did. We had a very lightweight row cover. You put it in the field and you just physically keep them out. Now you're probably going to say, well, I need pollination. So how does this work? And so what we would do is when they started having female flowers, we would pull the row covers off and that would let the bees come in. And what would happen is that gave those plants enough of a head start that even if at that point the cucumber beetles came in and fed, you would actually still get a crop off of that without having to spray an insecticide. And so it wasn't perfect. You know, eventually the plants would go down, but that was a way to keep the insects off. Another thing, eggplants, flea beetles will chew up eggplants. You can do the same thing with them. Other types, now for certain pests like aphids, sometimes they can thrive underneath those covers. All it takes is a few aphids to get underneath there, and they can grow and spread with no predators. So you do have to be careful about certain things, but they can be very effective for keeping out certain pests. It's something worth looking into.
You mentioned that spiders were a good biological control. Are they available for purchase now?
Not that I'm aware of, but if you are looking for biological controls, Koppert, Koppert, or they're actually BioBest or Koppert, but if you do a Google search for them, Koppert, they're like the leaders in biological controls. And we had a big program for the nursery industry a few years ago, a whole day program for biological controls. And it's really interesting. They actually sell food for the biological control. So let's say they eat all your pests. You don't want them to starve. So you can put out food, and there's different, obviously controls for different pests. But if you do want to use those as an educational tool, it's pretty interesting too. It's worth checking them out.
Great, thank you.
Mhm. A couple other things that you can do that I would really stress for pathogens is using resistant cultivars. If you can get something that's got resistance bred into it, you're going to be so much further ahead. And so these pictures were actually a study I did a number of years ago. This was looking at powdery mildew in pumpkin. And the variety, the gladiator variety, had resistance, homozygous resistance, so 2 copies of a resistance gene, and the variety on the right had none. And we didn't spray any fungicides on them, didn't treat them any differently. They were about 20 yards apart in the field. And that's the difference that you can get with resistance. And so it's something that I would encourage you to do. And just about all vegetables, not all of them, but just about all veggies are GMO free. And so most, except for virus resistance and some squash, all of these are going to be conventionally bred resistance as well. Crop rotation, you may have covered this in some other things, but this is a general slide, and I'll send a PDF of this as well, just to keep your crop groups together to rotate them. I would say out of all of these, you have your potatoes, your eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, and then your cucurbits, your pumpkins, your squash. Corn is a very good rotation crop because there's not a lot of diseases that are shared between them. And so, for example, there are some diseases shared between tomatoes and different cucurbit crops, but corn is a very good way to break up your rotation. And so if you do plant sweet corn at home, you know, I would try to put corn in at least 1 out of every 3 years to follow some of these things. Then of course your brassicas, they do share diseases together, and a few with some of the cucurbits. But most people plant cucurbits, brassicas, and then also your tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. So if there's a way that you could stick corn in between some of those, that would be very helpful in breaking up that disease cycle. Typically, you know, we recommend a 3-year rotation. Some people go as far as 7 years in these very complex rotations, but 3 years is typically adequate for most things. And honestly, you could probably get away with in a raised bed, you know, since it's sterile media that you're putting in there usually to start with, you could get away with a little bit shorter rotation in those. Some seed sources. I just wanted to put these up. You've probably seen some of these out there. Baker Creek seeds. They're pretty cool. They have a lot of really neat heirloom types. Check them out. Some of their stuff doesn't have the best germination because they'll get it from these kind of off-the-wall sources. But if you want to grow something like really different, definitely check them out. Johnny's. Johnny's is probably one of the more popular ones now because they have very good internet service, very high quality seeds. Always had good luck with them. And then some of the other ones that are out there. For a long time, it was very difficult to get some of the newest varieties with disease resistance on a gardener type scale. Most of the big seed companies only want to sell 10,000 seed or more. But some of these companies, particularly Johnny's and Harris Seeds, do actually get some of those newer types in smaller quantities, you know, 20 count or 50 count seeds. So worth checking out. And so I didn't know if we're about 10:30, and I was going to now jump into, you know, most of our veggie crops and production specifics to them. Would you like to take like a 5-minute break real quick, or it's up to y'all?
I think that'd be good.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna go check on my son downstairs real quick, and we can get back on in about 5 minutes. We'll do asparagus and then kind of run through all the veggies.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Veggies that you obviously often will grow, and then some that you may not grow. You know, in the first, asparagus, I think it's something it's a little trickier to grow in Georgia because of our warm winters. But being in Gwinnett County, you're further north, you should be able to get a pretty reasonable crop of asparagus. And further south, it generally tends to kind of fizzle out after 2 or 3 years. But asparagus is something that I really like, fresh asparagus, and it's a perennial crop. If you wanted to, you could actually buy asparagus seed and grow a plant up as a transplant. But most people buy crowns, and basically a crown is a 1-year-old plant, essentially. And so crowns are more expensive, but you know, you don't have to wait a whole nother year. And so typically if you're going to plant asparagus, you would dig a trench, usually in the 6 to 8 inch deep range. In this picture here, they've amended it with some compost. It would be recommended to pull a soil test ahead of time, since asparagus is planted so deep. If you do have some major deficiencies, that would be the time to correct it at planting. And then typically you plant them about 12 to 14 inches apart in a row, and then 4 or 5 feet apart between rows. If you've got more room, you could plant the rows further apart, since when asparagus does fern out later in the year, it does get pretty big. A couple of tips. If you do buy crowns, and let's say you buy a box of 20 crowns, plant the ones that are the same size together in a row. So if you've got maybe 4 or 5 really small crowns in what you purchase, plant them together, because if you plant them next to a bigger crown, they'll get outcompeted, and you effectively won't get much out of it. And then once you plant them a few inches deep, you can cover them flat, and then over time you kind of mound up the soil around them and so on. I would say most of the varieties that you're going to buy now, they're all, the newer hybrid varieties are quite good. All the new varieties are all male, and typically with all male plants, you don't get volunteer plants, and they put more resources into producing ferns instead of producing seed. And so you want all male plants. Some of the old ones were mixed male and female. If you're looking, the two basic centers in the US that have really good asparagus breeding would be UC Davis and Rutgers. And so most of the varieties are going to be out of California or out of New Jersey. And so there are some out of Canada. There's one called Millennial Guelph at a University of Guelph, but it's not well suited to the heat. And if I was going to choose, there are some good varieties out of Jersey, but some of the stuff out of California is a little more adaptable to our climate. Jersey Giant is kind of the yield standard. It's a really thick, large spear. Think about like those steakhouse spears. I would say that with the heat that we have in Georgia, we're probably not going to produce those really massive spears all the time. We might get a few, but over time, we just don't get the size that they do up north. Typically, when you plant your asparagus, you'll plant it your first year. You won't harvest anything. You'll let it fern out and just grow. The second year it's planted, so that plant is now 3 years old, a 1-year-old crown plus 2 years. You can harvest just a little bit, but it's generally recommended to wait to your third year. That way there's enough carbohydrate reserves in the plant where you can take some spears as they come out of the ground, and you're not going to harm your plant. And then keep harvesting when you start getting a bunch of really thin, pencil size spears. You need to stop harvesting and just let them fern out, because it means it's running out of reserves in the plant. Jersey Supreme, again, it's another large one. It's got rust resistance, and we do have asparagus rust here in Georgia, and so that's something to look at. Purple Passion, if you want purple asparagus, it's the only pretty much one out there. If you want to grow white asparagus, it's basically the same varieties that we grow for green. It's just that they're protected from sunlight. And so you could actually, in large scale production, they just cover up the rows with dirt. But you could cover them with some sort of shading to prevent sunlight from getting in there if you want to get fancy and grow white asparagus. Like I said, you can harvest 1 year without really hurting them, but really your third year is probably when you can actually get like a realistic, decent harvest out of it. And then just keep in mind, especially with the heat we have here in the spring, asparagus spears can actually grow extremely quickly. So it's something that you can harvest on a little bit every day if you'd like. And so, and over time, actually, the first year or so, you might want to irrigate. But after that, asparagus gets such a tremendous root system on it that you don't generally have to irrigate very much unless we go into a severe drought. We had a 20-year-old asparagus planting when I worked at the University of Kentucky, and we actually dug up crowns with a backhoe. I mean, they were that big. And so it's one of those things, as long as you keep the weeds out of it, it kind of takes care of itself. I wanted to cover a few cool season crops, and the reason I may spend a little bit more time on some of the cool season stuff is because I was trying to think about like the school year and stuff like sweet potatoes that come on midsummer. No one's going to be around necessarily for that, so I thought maybe some of the things that would be out during the school year might be a little more appropriate and stuff. So I'm going to cover some of the greens, lettuces, and so on. So We've done actually a lot of lettuce trials, romaine lettuce, leaf lettuce, some of the heading types. I will say in general, the leaf types will tend to produce a little bit better here than some of the romaines because they're a little bit more tolerant of the stress that we have. If you plant them in the fall, we do have some issues with temperature, stress, and germination. So I'd probably wait until September to try to plant some of these. We've done some August plantings and they've worked, but we get a lot better results if we wait to kind of mid to late September. And then if you have some protection, like a row cover, planting in February can work, but realistically March. The problem with spring planting in Georgia with a lot of lettuces is that when they're maturing, they start getting really hot. And generally they're not, unless you have like a high tunnel or some type of protection, you can't do that well with them midwinter. And so if you wait late enough to avoid some of our hard freezes in the spring, then they're maturing during the heat. And so we actually did grow some lettuce last year in the high tunnel in June with shade cloth, and it was very effective. But in the open field, we had zero harvestable, marketable lettuce. And so you can use some things like shade cloth and stuff. Look at some of the leaf types. I would say Johnny's Seeds probably has the best selection of lettuce out there. There's a few Summer Crisp types of lettuce. They're more heat tolerant, and they've done pretty well for us. The other types that have done pretty well are the Salanova types. It's a trademark type. They have several different types of Salanovas, but they've done also fairly well in our trials. Here's a shot of some of the different types out there. So the Novelda there, that's a mini romaine or little gem. You might see them in the grocery store. They're sold in clamshells. They're very quick. And so if you grow a transplant, typically you can harvest these 30 days from transplant. And so that might be something to do in an educational environment where to keep people's attention and so forth. Your typical Helvius, that's a standard romaine type. Again, they take a little bit longer. Some of these ones like Lovelock, Magenta, New Red Fire, they're more leafy and they work fairly well in our stressful conditions. I threw a picture down there. It's Patrona. That's an open heart lettuce, and it's actually a modified romaine that all the leaves are the same size. And so when you cut it once, it's like an instant salad. So anyway, Johnny's has most of these varieties and be worth looking at, certainly. In terms of bolting, lettuce, obviously, when it starts to bolt, it gets very bitter. It doesn't taste very well. And so you can see these two pictures. The picture on the left there, the stem is starting to elongate, and you can see between the leaves, you're getting a little bit more space. And so this lettuce is going to flower or bolt fairly soon, and it's probably not going to taste that great. And so this one on the right side is not going to bolt anytime soon. You can see how the leaves are nice and tight. It's going to have a better flavor. And so if you're growing like a romaine type and you start seeing that stretching and elongation in the head, you should probably go ahead and harvest it sooner rather than later because it is going to flower. Like I said, quality consideration, bolting, a lot of differences in varieties. This was the same trial that we did. You can see the difference in bolting. That lettuce on the right side would be pretty gross to eat at that point, and be incredibly bitter. And so you do want to make sure you catch it before they bolt. A little bit on cole crops. So our climate is very good for cole crops here, particularly in the fall. When you go from warm to cool in Georgia for a lot of our cole crops, it actually works out fairly well. And the reason is that if you put a transplant in the ground when it's still warm or even hot, you can get a tremendous amount of growth on it. But the crop is maturing when it's a little bit cooler. And so it's a little bit less stressful and you get a little bit better flavor. in the spring, when we do cole crops, broccoli and so forth, for example, you're going from cool to hot. And so in that cool weather, the plant sometimes doesn't grow that quickly. And then all of a sudden you go to this period of heat when it's trying to mature, and you can get some quality issues. And so for broccoli, cauliflower, in particular, in the fall, we do much better. And you can plant broccoli plants the first week of September in the fall. It is pretty stressful for them, but then they're maturing typically around Thanksgiving. And so we generally don't have a hard freeze at that point. And so it's maturing when it's a lot milder. The same thing with cauliflower. And so one thing I did want to point out with cauliflower is, and this could actually be a pretty good school exercise, is that cauliflower has a vernalization requirement. And so cauliflower has to be exposed to some cold weather to start flowering, to get a curd on it, essentially. And so if you planted cauliflower of a typical overwintering type in August and then planted in September, generally they're going to mature at the same time because they're both going to hit that cold weather period at the same time. Now there are semi-tropical types of cauliflower. They're grown a lot in India and parts of Africa, and they do not have this firm vernalization requirement. And so if you plant them in August, they'll actually mature by mid-October. But this is actually something that's come up where you can talk about plant physiology with folks in vernalization and actually have a real world example. We actually had a large farmer in South Georgia who planted 600 acres of cauliflower. It was planted August 10th, but because of the lack of cold weather, it did not mature until December, and it threw off their harvest schedule. And actually they lost like $1 million on that crop because they hit a different window, and it's all because of the vernalization requirement. So cauliflower is kind of a unique case, and you can cover some plant physiology with that. Cabbage, Bravo is a standard cabbage, been around for many, many years, works fairly well in Georgia. And then kale, there's several different types of kale out there. Winter boar is your common curly kale. Tuscan kale is often called lacinato or dinosaur kale. Same family, totally different shape. Could be a good way to discuss differences even within a single species. And then of course collards do really, really well here. And out of all of these, collards are probably the most stress tolerant out of them.
And are these hybrid varieties, if you get those, you can't get those from transplant like from Bonnie's or something like that, can you? You just grow from seed?
Some of them. I would say the majority. So Bonnie's will probably have like Bravo cabbage. They may have Emerald Crown broccoli. Emerald Crown is a really good broccoli. It's kind of our industry standard. It's been around for a while, so you might be able to get them from them. Emerald Crown is another kind of educational thing. It's conventionally bred. It's not GMO or anything, but it's been selected to not have anthocyanins in it. And so in the fall, when you get cold weather, broccoli will kind of purple up. And even though there's nothing wrong with it, you can't sell purpley tinged broccoli. You got to mow it down. And so Emerald Crown, because it does not have anthocyanins in it, will actually stay green even after a frost. And so that's why it's our number one broccoli. It's probably 95% of the acres in the eastern US, and for that reason. So you might be able to get that. Most of the cauliflower from like Bonnie's and stuff is going to be the older winter types which need vernalization. And then collards haven't changed much in the past 20 years, so you're pretty good there. And then kale's also winter boar, has been around for a while, so you could probably get that.
And if you're going to plant any of those cole crops from seed, would you get it started maybe mid-August?
I would, with fall planting, it's one, you have to plant earlier than you think you should, you know, and so we plant in South Georgia, they'll start planting August 15th, and it's still, you know, 98 degrees. But by the time that plant is maturing, you know, it's cooled off, we're in the 60s and stuff. And so it is stressful for the plant, but yeah, definitely I would start seeding them out in August or even late July. And in North Georgia, you know, our light levels and our and growth kind of tanks once we hit November. And so you want to have a good stout plant there before we hit that period of the year where we just don't get much growth. For kale, I just put this in because we actually did a lot of kale research. And for those that are interested that like to cook and different types of kale, so there's your traditional curly leafed kale. It's your winter boar, darky boar. You know, it's what you're used to buying. Then there's also the Tuscan kale, Toscana, dinosaur kale. It's that different type, usually that dark blue looking. It's more gourmet. I will say that it has really terrible disease resistance, and so you get more disease with that. And then there's actually something that you may run into, Siberian kale, and a lot of times you see it's very frilly, and this is actually technically not kale. It's or it's called Hanover kale. It's actually a different species of brassica, and Siberians, they tend to they're used commercially for more like baby kale and kale salads and stuff like that because they tend to be very tender when they're small. They're not that great when they're full size, but as a small tender plant, they work better. And they use this for like kale salads because you have to plant a lot of it to harvest it young, and the seed is really cheap, actually. And then if you're really into doing some different things, there's something called Portuguese kale or Tranchuda kale. And this is actually a non-heading cabbage. So it's a cabbage that never forms a head. And the stems on it are really thick and it's really sweet. And if you like to juice kale, this is actually what commercially, if you were to buy kale juice, what they would use, because there's a lot more juice in these plants than regular old kale. And they're sweeter too, so they taste better. So anyway, there's a lot of different things that go into this. And if you've got some different cooking interests and so forth, there's your kale. Broccoli, like I mentioned, the emerald crown is anthocyanin-less, and so that picture in the bottom of the screen, you can see basically it's after a cold spell, and the picture on the left is emerald crown, and the picture on the right is a typical variety, and you can see how it purples up, and so that's the big selling point. Also, broccoli, if you're reading a catalog, there are different varieties that are bred for different purposes. And so anything with a crown in the name is sold for crown cut. And you can see that on the right side, that's a typical crown cut. It's actually harvested a couple days late. But and then there are other varieties that are sold for broccoli bunching. So when you go to the store and you buy 2 or 3 rubber banded together, a lot of times that's a different variety, or they're packed really close together to get bunching. Conversely, when you sell bunching broccoli, most of the weight is actually in the stem. And so those varieties tend to have thicker stems on them. And so when you're buying bunching broccoli, you're actually paying a lot for the stem. So if you cut it off and throw it away, sometimes it's not worth it. Spacing, broccoli is really affected by spacing. And so this was a picture we took in December, in South Georgia. On the left side, that was planted 12 inches apart. On the right side, it's 6 inches apart. And so typically the further you space them apart, obviously you'll get a bigger head and they'll mature quicker too. And so in a field scenario where you're growing hundreds of acres, you would plant them very close together to maximize production. But for a home garden scenario, planting about a foot apart in row is usually just fine. And then some different things that we run into. This top picture is called cat eyes. That's the broccoli's still fine to eat, but you see these little yellow spots and stuff where you get cat eyes. And then that bottom picture is a broccoli that is very out of season here. It was a variety that we trialed, and it didn't do particularly well in the heat that we had in Georgia. It's more for northern climate. It's grown a lot in Maine. And so definitely when you're looking through the catalogs, look for things that are heat adapted as well. A couple other things, you'll see this both in cauliflower and broccoli, hollow stem. And so that top picture shows two different types of hollow stem. One of them where you see these splits inside and a lot of browning, that's actually caused by a boron deficiency. And so you can correct it with adding a little bit of borax or boron. On the left side of that top picture, there's not much browning, there's no gaps in it. And so sometimes you'll get a split in the middle of broccoli just from having really fast growth or excessive nitrogen. So if you do have a split in broccoli, if it's not browning, if it's just a small hollow spot, you didn't really do anything wrong. We just had conditions for excessive growth and so on. And that bottom picture is also a boron deficiency as well. So again, a little bit of borax and stuff, you'd be fine. Cauliflower, I mentioned, this is one of those things where it is kind of a neat crop in terms of education. This picture here, Fujiyama, that is a semi-tropical type. And so that picture was taken on the 3rd of November. So it would have been planted very early, late summer actually, and they'll head up. And so anything you see in a seed catalog that's very early, like 55, 60 days, is probably a semi-tropical type. Anything that's more like 86 days or 82 days would be a full winter type that's going to need that vernalization requirement. And for broccoli, you want to, for cauliflower rather, you want to plant it a little bit further apart than you would broccoli because the heads get bigger. And so typically you could go 12 to 14 inches on cauliflower to get that additional size. And then head wrap, this is also kind of an interesting thing in terms of education. Some varieties say that they're self-wrapping, which means that the leaves wrap around the heads. Commercially though, because you don't want the broccoli the cauliflower to yellow up, you have to protect it from sunlight. And so what you would do commercially is they actually take rubber bands and pull the leaves together and put the rubber band over it so no light can get in there. They also sell, like I said, self-wrapping types that'll have leaves that kind of wrap around the head. I don't know if I don't have a picture here. This is supposed to be a self-wrapping type, but you can see later in growth that light does get in there. So that's something that you can talk about sunlight and changing colors and stuff like that. It is also sensitive to low boron, just like broccoli. Wider spacing, 10 inches is the minimum. I would go a little bit wider. And the head is a little bit more sensitive to the cold than broccoli. It'll get what I call pinking, actually. You'll see these pink or purple trends in the head. And so it doesn't like the cold weather quite as much as some of the other brassicas. And then one veggie that we actually do have commercial acreage in the state of Georgia, but I like Brussels sprouts, and they're really kind of a cool veggie, I think, to cover. But there are tremendous differences in varieties. This is one where if you buy like the Bonnie's Brussels sprouts, typically they're going to be like a Jade Cross or Churchill or something. And those are old varieties and they don't work very well for us. The other thing with Brussels sprouts is When you plant them, they take a very, very long time to grow. And so up here in North Georgia, we actually have a hard time growing them because it gets cold before they've had enough size. And so this picture is from Brussels sprouts that I harvested in December in South Georgia. And these plants were started in the greenhouse in mid-July, the seedlings. We planted them in the field in late August as 6 or 7 week old transplants, and then grew these out, September, October, November, partially through December. So we had close to more than 6 months actually in these plants. But Brussels sprouts, I think they're a cool vegetable. A couple of things, I have these different pictures here with kiting, topped only, kiting and topped, and doing nothing. And so when you're growing Brussels sprouts, I would encourage you to plant them fairly earlier than you would think here, because you want to get a big plant with some growth. When they start producing little kind of marble size sprouts on the bottom of that plant, you can top the plant. Basically, take the top out of the plant, cut it, and that'll help the remainder of those sprouts to uniformly size up. Now, if you want, you can just harvest them 2 or 3 at a time during the whole time period, but topping helps get them kind of concentrated. And you see that picture on the far right, that's when we did nothing. We just let the plant grow, and it kept growing and growing and growing, but didn't really do much in terms of sprouts. Kiting is what you do when you cut the leaves off the sides. So sometimes you'll see a picture of Brussels sprouts in the field with no leaves on them, just some stalks sticking out. And that's what kiting does. But we found it not to really be all that helpful. So this variety, Franklin, isn't that great. I'm going to show you some other ones that are a little bit better. Hestia is a good variety. It's from Bijou Seeds. Johnny's has a lot of these, the newer ones. But you see the dramatic difference in management. The picture on the far right is doing nothing, didn't get anything out of it. And then where we topped it and or kited it. And then again, some of the differences. Dagon is a very early variety. You can get a lot of good sprouts out of it, but you have to build a very big plant before it starts setting sprouts. Brussels sprouts plants do get very large, and so we planted them 2 feet apart in the row, and planted our rows on 3 feet apart for the row, and so they do get very, very large. Here's Churchill. This is an old variety. I probably wouldn't recommend it. What happens is you can see the bottom of these pictures. The sprouts don't look very good, but you see the sprouts kind of blow out, and they don't stay really firm. They mature, and if you don't harvest them really quickly, they're not very good. And then Nelson, this is another old one. I would not recommend this one. So we've covered kale already, like I said, so we don't need to cover that again. I think we'll skip into a little bit of insect control here.
A couple questions, and this might not be the time to ask something about seeding, but on kale. I've got a teacher that's letting her kale grow out, and she's collected seeds, and she wanted to know when she should plant those. But my thing is that kale, if it's a hybrid or not. It's just more complex.
Yeah, so if it's a open pollinated kale, and a lot of the older kales are open pollinated, then the seed will come true to type. If it's hybrid, it probably won't. I mean, you'll get some stuff that looks like kale, some that looks a little wonky. And so if it's an open pollinated type, you can save the seed. And I would probably seed them out as long as you have a place that you can keep cool so that they'll germinate. I would seed them in late July, maybe the 1st of August. And then that way you'll have a plant that a transplant you could put in the ground right after Labor Day. And so It'll still be hot, the plant will be a little stressed, but you'll get a lot of growth on it in that September to mid-October period. Whereas if you wait until October 1st, that kale, typically you'll start cutting it 45 to 50 days out. You know, we'll start getting real short days in November and stuff. So the downside is you do have to water the heck out of it when you first plant it that early in the year.
And will the crops, can you overwinter them here?
Some of them, yes. If you protect them, you can overwinter them. We'll grow collards and stuff through the winter. And in South Georgia, we've had kale. We'll strip leaves and grow it for 5-6 months. It gets kind of rough towards the end. But you can overwinter them as long as you have some protection. Something like collards will tolerate down to about 21 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabbage is closer to the 25-degree range. Broccoli is kind of interesting. If your broccoli doesn't have a head on it, it'll tolerate like 25 degrees. But if you've got a head, you can only tolerate about 27, 28 because you'll get damage to it. And so depending upon the stage, you'll get a little bit more protection. But if you have like a row cover, just a cheap row cover that you want to bring out on the few nights that it is cold, we can overwinter them. A couple things real quick on insect control, because you probably will get some worms that come in, whether they're cabbage loopers, imported diamondback moth, or what have you, to chew on your cole crops. One of the best tools we have, it is organic. It's BT, it's Bacillus thuringiensis. Bacillus thuringiensis is actually a soil-borne bacteria, but it does produce a protein crystal that's toxic when the caterpillar ingests it. And so if you spray it on the plant, the caterpillar will eat it. Usually it takes a few days because it starves to death. And BT doesn't hold up real well to UV light. So you do have to spray it a few times during the season. But it is very safe, and it's something that, at least for worms in cabbage and kale and stuff, we do have some alternatives to control. A little bit on potatoes. We actually have some potatoes out at the farm right now that we have to harvest that did really well. The specialty gourmet fingerling potatoes do very well here because we can have some short windows for them. Of course, you have the old red Pontiacs and red Lesotas. They're oldies, but they tolerate some of our stresses pretty well. I will say that the russet type potatoes do not do well here. And I'll show a picture in a second of what happens to them. Russet type potatoes need cooler night temperatures. And when you have real warm nights and cold nights and warm nights, you get knobs on your potatoes. I'll show that in a second here. But that's something where you could plant a potato in February and harvest before the end of the school year and actually get something out of it. And they'll tolerate a little bit of a light freeze and so forth when they're coming out of the ground. Like I said, tuber enlargement is best if we have about 70 degrees during the day and 50 to 60 at night. And so the night temperature is really important, actually. And so that's something that, think about when our nights are in the high 50s, low 60s, that's ideal. That picture on the bottom right is actually a knobby potato. It's fine to eat, but obviously people don't want potatoes that look like that. And that's when you get really hot soil temperatures above about 85 degrees with a russet type potato. You'll get those knobbiness to it. But potatoes are kind of a thing that would fit in pretty well with the school year and so forth. And it is pretty easy to grow. You're just going to buy seed pieces. So if you are going to plant them from seed pieces, cut them about a day before to let the seed pieces dry out, and they'll actually suberize over them to protect them from disease. You don't want to put a wet seed piece in the ground because it attracts a lot of fungal pathogens. A commercial potato grower would dust them with fungicide, but you're probably not going to do that. And so a couple other tricks you can do is store your potatoes at about 60 degrees or even room temperature to get them kind of to break dormancy before you plant them, so that when they go in the ground, they're ready to go. Just like if you leave potatoes under your sink or in your pantry, you know, eventually they'll sprout. And so you want to get them where they're not sprouting, but they're kind of ready to jump. And then with potatoes, of course, we do have the purple and the red potatoes. Most of the time, I'll be honest, they're kind of a little disappointing because they're more washed out colors than what they show in the seed catalog. But there's an Adirondack blue there in the corner. Fingerling potatoes, Swedish peanut, Russian banana, they both grow very well. They're really quick to harvest, and so that's why they might be kind of a good educational tool. They don't obviously get the size that some of the other ones do, but they are fast. And then all red and all blue, you can see some of the pictures we had here. Again, the seed catalog will show this really intense red potato, and usually it's more washed out than that. And could be disappointing, but they're kind of neat, you know, a little bit different to have. Red gold is an excellent potato. It's a little harder to get. It's got a gold flesh with a red skin. And they don't get as big as like a red Pontiac, which are what you would find at most feed and seed stores. But they're very, very good new potatoes. So if you're into cooking and stuff like that, red golds are worth looking at. Red Pontiac, these are probably the most popular red potato. It's not the prettiest tuber out there, but they do yield very well. They're found pretty much, they're easy to get. They're very widely adaptable. The other one that's similar is red Lesota. If you buy, Florida actually has a lot of potato production in the Hastings area, and red Lesota is kind of their standard. It's been that standard for a number of years, so it's a little more heat tolerant. And so if you can get red Lesota, they work a little bit better in Georgia than the Pontiacs and so on. A couple things on onions. Again, this is also something that can be done during the school year. Plus, you can tie in with Vidalia being a very significant onion producer. And there's some physiology here that you can cover as well. So onions, they bulb in response typically to day length. And there's 3 different types of onions. There's long day, intermediate day, and short day. And so long day onions are what you would grow up north throughout the summer. They need a 14-hour day to start bulbing. If you grow long days here, they will bulb, but it's during the heat of the summer and it's not a good environment. Intermediate day onions are about 12 hours, and these are like the candy onions that you see out there. And then short day start bulbing when we get more to 11 hours or so. And short day onions are what we grow in Vidalia. So they'll bulb in late winter when our days start getting longer. And so typically they'll be done by late April in most years. And so you could get them out before the end of the school year. And so typically you can also do green onions, which is simply just an immature plant. Onions are biennial, so they bulb out the first year, they flower the second year. And most onions that are grown in Georgia are transplants. You can also buy onion sets. And so sets are little tiny bulblets. And so you can get small sets, you can put them in the ground and they'll actually produce a large bulb. If you want to, you can actually stick a bulb in the ground and it'll split up into a bunch of different sets and you can plant them in subsequent years. But most of the time we're growing transplants. And if you can probably pick up onion transplants, Georgia grown transplants are typically planted in November to December. For up here, I would probably plant them a little bit before Thanksgiving. Some of the early onions you could even plant around Halloween. That would be available in stores and so forth. But those are some onion transplants planted in Vidalia. You don't have to cut the tops off them. It helps a little bit. The main reason we do this commercially is that they spray herbicide over the top, and you don't want leaf area. You don't want that herbicide to touch a lot of leaves because it can damage the plant. And so typically, shoot for kind of a mid-November period. And then you would harvest probably going into April. And again, you could cover kind of the day length when bulbing is initiated and so forth. And then Vidalias tend to be sweet because we have low sulfur in the sandy soils down there. And so that's why they tend to be very mild. But if you added a lot of sulfur, you could make a Vidalia onion really, really hot and pungent as well. So I debated on covering sweet corn. Obviously, a lot of people in the home garden plant sweet corn, and I think it's great because I think fresh sweet corn is fantastic. Sweet corn would probably come on a little bit late in the spring, so it wouldn't be a great crop to plant in the spring for students. But in the fall, you could plant it right when school started up. It'd be tight, and you could probably get an early variety out before you got to freeze. It would be close though. But in terms of sweet corn, it's interesting because there's a lot of genetics involved. And so there's probably more than 9 types of sweet corn out there now. Most of these different types come from different combinations of 3 sets of genes. And so the SU gene is what you have a recessive copy in your standard sweet corn. So the sweet corn that's been around, like the Silver Queen and stuff, for the last 50 years or so, that's the standard SU gene. There's also a gene called the sugary enhanced gene, and this increases sugar, and it also lends kind of a creamy flavor to the corn, and that's the SE gene. And then you have the shrunken 2 or the super sweet gene. And this is what we have in the varieties that you buy in a store. So the shrunken 2 or super sweet gene produces a lot more sugar, and it also reduces the conversion of sugar to starch. And so in sweet corn, after you harvest it, a lot of those sugars get converted to starch. And so that's what you don't want to have because it doesn't taste as good. And then there's all different combinations of these different genes in corn that you buy in the grocery store. So sugary enhanced, I just mentioned, has 1 or 2 copies of a recessive gene. It produces extra sugars, but it still has starch conversion. The reason that it is creamy is it contains phytoglucogen, which is a soluble starch, and that makes it kind of creamy and stuff. Super sweets contain a recessive gene of SH2, and so it increases sugars and prevents starch conversion. Super sweets don't germinate that well because there's no starch in the seed. But in terms of genetics, you can talk about recessive genes and dominant genes and how these are inherited, and how that translates into what you actually consume. This is a shrunken 2 kernel, and you can see the pink on the outside is the seed coat, but the actual seed kernel is on the inside, and just like the name suggests, it's shrunken. There's no starch in it, so it doesn't look like a normal kernel of corn. And because of that, they do not germinate well in cool soil, and so because there's no starch reserves and so forth. There's other types, synergistics, you have different combinations, augmented super sweets, you have SE and SH2s. You can also talk about isolation. If you plant field corn near any of these types, the field corn will have dominant versions of all these genes, and so pretty much it'll ruin the flavor of your corn. And then if you are a sweet corn aficionado, Rye corn, it's bred out of Japan, they contain recessive copies of all of these genes. They're very hard to grow, but they do have superior flavor, but they tend to be very difficult to get a good size to. So you have to isolate some of these. SEs and SUs you can grow together. SH2s you can grow together. If you mix an SE and an SH2, you can get some off flavors. And so you can keep them isolated through space or just planting different times because outside of pollination, they don't affect each other. So you just don't want them to pollinate at the same time. So anyway, lot to cover in just a few minutes, but I thought this is kind of a good exercise in terms of genetics, and this is all conventionally bred, but it can be a useful exercise for students. Now, tomatoes, just about everyone grows tomatoes. Everyone has their own opinions on the best variety of tomato. So I was just going to cover some of the common things that you run into and how to correct them with tomatoes today. And so a lot of times in the field, we see both potassium and magnesium deficiencies. Typically, you will see these on the lower foliage of the plant. When you start to set the second fruit cluster, the plant's pulling a lot of nutrients out of the old leaves. And so you'll get deficiencies in some of the foliage. Potassium and magnesium can look similar, except potassium, you'll tend to get some browning and necrosis on the margins of the leaves, whereas magnesium, it just has this more bright white interveinal chlorosis on the old leaves. You can correct the magnesium with some Epsom salts. Potassium's a little bit harder to correct because most of the potassium sources are not as soluble. By the time you get your third fruit cluster set, most of these deficiencies aren't going to be an issue because your fruit is already set at that point. And so at that point, it's not really worth your time correcting them. But anyway, if you grow them and you do see those are two of the most common. Blossom end rot. Everyone gets blossom end rot at some point. Technically, this is a calcium deficiency in the cell. And what happens is that the cell dies, and then as the fruit expands, those cells kind of expand with it. But most of the time we see this, it's actually not a problem with a lack of calcium in the soil. We see it due to water stress. And so calcium moves in the plant with the transpiration stream. And when you do have stress in water, where you get uneven watering or you don't have good movement of water, that calcium doesn't get moved into the plant. And so irregular moisture can affect it as well. Actually, times when we have extremely high humidity and you don't have a lot of transpiration from the plant, you'll see blossom end rot as well. Cracking, this is pretty common. It's almost impossible to prevent. It's basically when you have a rainfall event and you get a lot of moisture absorbed into the plant, and the stem scar is highly lignified, and so the fruit tries to expand, but it can't. And so there's not a whole lot you can do with cracking. Just if you're seeing it without rain, it's probably an irrigation thing. But most of the time it's a rain-driven event. One thing that I just put in there because it's kind of an interesting oddity, zippering. It doesn't affect the fruit or anything like that. But this is actually when the flower petal, during fruit set and pollination, when the flower petal fails to fall off completely, you'll actually get zippering, and it's the flower petal touching the fruit when it's very young, and you'll get that little zipper look to it. And then cat facing. Cat facing is supposed to look like a smushed up cat face kind of. And so this is generally a pollination issue. It could be due to either really high temperatures or cool temperatures where your pollen may not have been viable. And a lot of the old heirloom types, particularly the larger fruited types, tend to cat face more. But it is typically related to pollen, whether it's viable pollen or the act of pollination. And so there's not a lot you can do about it because generally those conditions are to a degree out of your control. Because tomatoes by and large are self-pollinated. They need a little bit of vibration on the flower to shake that pollen from the anther to the stigma, but again, they are typically self-pollinated. A little bit on cucurbits. These are kind of difficult to do because a lot of our cucurbits, especially the interesting ones, come off in the fall. So it'd be kind of cool in school to grow like these African kettle gourds, but you have to plant them early in the summer. And so it is kind of challenging. If you want to do something like squash or zucchini, they're generally very quick to harvest, but some of the other long season ones like watermelons, they come off after the school year. One thing though, if you do grow cucurbits, is pollination is important. If you just have 2 or 3 in your yard, you're going to have enough native bees out there, honeybees and or bumblebees to pollinate. Some of the bigger cucurbits, you need 8 to 10 visits from bees to get pollination. But again, as long as you have, some plantings around it, you'll have enough native bees to come in. Good weather is essential. If you have really cold, rainy weather, bees aren't as active, especially honeybees, and so you don't get as many visits, and so you could have some poor fruit set. Most pollination is done in the morning, usually between 9 a.m. and noon. This is from a commercial watermelon field. So our watermelon growers typically would have 1 hive per acre that they would contract with a beekeeper to put out. But one thing I would say, gardener, grower, otherwise, is if you're going to spray an insecticide, try to spray it late in the day, going into dusk even. Sometimes if you spray late in the afternoon, it can be a little bit hot and you could get some damage, but most of your pollinators are out there in the morning. So that's the worst time to spray an insecticide. You don't want to be spraying when your pollinators are active because you can kill your bees. Some of our watermelon growers will actually start spraying at 8 o'clock at night, and they'll spray through the night so that they can avoid hurting your pollinators. And so, we think of honeybees and typical hives. Again, squash bees, it's a native bee. They're kind of neat. They're ground nesting bees. And as their name suggests, they pollinate squash. And so where there's undisturbed land where they can nest, you'll see squash bees and of course bumblebees. Bumblebees are much more efficient than honeybees in terms of pollination. It's just there's far fewer of them compared to honeybees. But bumblebees carry tremendously more pollen. So if you have a lot of bumblebees in your yard, you should have good pollination. We already talked a little bit about watermelons, but I don't think they're necessarily ideal for growing in school. But from a genetics standpoint, I did want to talk about seedless watermelons and how we get them. And so watermelons typically are diploid. So there's 2 copies of the chromosomes. What you do is you take generally your female parent, and you treat those seed with colchicine. So that stops cell division. And so then you get, when cell division stops, you get a tetraploid parent, 4X, 4 copies of chromosomes. And so what commercial seed companies then do is they take that 4X maternal parent and they pollinize it with a diploid male. And so when you cross them, then you get a triploid hybrid. And those seed are viable. That's what we plant for our seedless melons, or all triploid melons. And you cross it so that you put that 3X seed out in the field, and then you put a pollinizer out there like I talked about, your regular seeded melon. And when they cross, you'll get fertilization, but you won't get viable seeds because it would be a 2.5X basically. And so that's how we get our seedless melons and so forth, is that we cross that triploid hybrid with a diploid to get incomplete seeds. And interestingly, with seedless melons, we actually have issues with genetics because there are very few female parents that will take being treated to colchicine well. So genetically, our seedless watermelons are not very diverse, and we have some disease issues because of that. There's only a handful of maternal parents that are used in the industry. So, and then that picture on the bottom right, that's a typical non-harvestable pollinizer. These little tiny, they're full of seed and stuff, and they don't taste very good at all. And then, yeah, we get our seedless melon. A couple things on squash and zucchini. We get a lot of viruses in squash and zucchini in the fall in particular, so it's a little bit harder to grow them. Of course, we have our crookneck yellow squash, straight neck yellow squash, and the zucchini. There's a couple of things I did want to point out that, again, are kind of interest, at least I think from an educational standpoint. Zucchini has been developed that it's spineless, so that the leaves don't have the spines on them and they don't cut you up. And that's a recessive trait, but there's a few varieties out there, Spineless Beauty. And so they're bred specifically so that when you harvest them in the field, you don't scratch the fruit. The other thing that's kind of neat is in squash, in yellow squash, we have problems with viruses, and it'll turn the squash, you'll get like a green tint to it, or you'll get green circles or something. So there's a gene called the precocious yellows gene. And precocious yellows just means that that fruit produces yellow pigment regardless of a virus infection. So it may be infected with a virus, but you can't see the greening because it's so yellow. And if you buy squash in the store, if you ever look at the stem on it, if it's got like a clear stem to it, that variety has the precocious yellows gene. If it's got a green stem, it does not. But again, that's all conventionally bred. That was developed in the 90s, but it's a way to get around virus resistance and so forth. Real quickly, I was gonna kind of wrap up with high tunnels, because I actually have had a fair number of educators contact me about doing small tunnels at their schools and stuff. So I just thought I wanted to cover it just for a few minutes. And so this is a picture of a high tunnel at an organic farm outside of Athens called Woodland Gardens. It's a pretty big tunnel. And so high tunnels are basically non-heated, passively ventilated structures. There's no heat, and you open the sides of them to vent them. They've been around for a long time. They were developed in the 50s at the University of Kentucky. The United States didn't adopt that technology because we went to very large farms that didn't utilize these structures. But in Asia and Europe, it had been adopted. And so it's a good geography lesson too, and I'll show some pictures in a second. Here's Dr. Emmert. I got a hold of these pictures when I worked at UK, and so this was him back in the late 50s working in the field. Things have changed a little bit. I would definitely say I haven't been in dress shoes in the field in a while, but that's kind of a crude high tunnel that he was making back then. But worldwide, there's a lot of high tunnels. In China, they have 1.9 million hectares, so that's close to 4 million acres of high tunnels. That's a tremendous, 4 million acres covered in plastic. And then they have these solar greenhouse structures, which are kind of a similar, not quite the same design. They got a 500,000 hectares, so about 1 million acres. So they have about 5 million acres covered in plastic there. And so a lot of intensive production. Like I said earlier, they produce a lot more vegetables because they're very, very intensively grown. You can even build a really cheap, low cost. There's plans for these on the internet. And so we used to build these. I built this for a small farmer in Eastern Kentucky using PVC pipe and using rope to hold down plastic. Obviously, it's not super well sealed, but it can give you a little bit of protection, and you can pull the sides up to vent it. And then this is a traditional high tunnel. Again, this is fairly large structure. It's 30 by 72 feet, so it does have a pretty big footprint. It's not something you're going to put in your backyard probably, but maybe a school site. The plus with high tunnels is that generally you don't need a building permit because they're non-permanent structures. Because you don't have electricity or heat in them, they're not considered permanent structures. There's different types. There's these big hay grove structures here. You see that bottom picture, you can connect these large structures together. We actually have a farm just south of the Georgia state line in Florida that has over 800 of these hay grove structures. It's 125 acres, solid under plastic. And so they grow spinach and some other things in there. But these hay groves, these are built more for larger scale operations because they're very tall and you can interconnect them together and you can drive a tractor in there. We have at the U Garden, if you're ever up there visiting, we have a couple of hay groves. When I teach organic farming, this is actually what we use in the class. All the students have to grow crops in there as part of their class. Fairly simple structure. Again, they're fairly tall. But the benefit that reason we use these is that this was back last spring. We did some temperature recordings, and you do get a little bit of the graph basically shows the outdoor temperature is blue, in the tunnel is red, and then we took some row cover in the tunnel, so it's like 2 layers of protection. And you get a little bit of frost protection. You can see, a few degrees. But really what we get in the early part of the years, during the day, it heats up to 75 or 80, and we get a lot quicker production of crops. So that's why we typically utilize them. And then lastly, this is just more of an educational oddity. Solar greenhouses, the name's kind of redundant. But basically these are south-facing structures with an earthen wall. This picture is taken from China, and that earthen wall basically absorbs heat during the day and then radiates it back out at night. And so it's passive solar heating. And we've actually got a few people in the States that have built these. Here's one from University of Manitoba, where they looked at different types of media to fill the wall. And it worked in Manitoba, actually, so they can certainly work here. But there's some engineering and so forth and some physics that you can cover with them. I built one up at the University of Kentucky a number of years ago. I split one side, I filled it with sand, this corrugated metal, and the other side I got barrels and I painted them black and filled with water. And then we compared the two in terms of re-radiating heat. And actually, interesting, we found that the water barrels radiated more heat, but they did it so quickly that by 5 or 6 in the morning, when it was the coolest time of night, that the sand-filled wall actually worked a little bit better. Anyway, this would not be OSHA approved, and I would not put students underneath a wall filled with like 6 tons of sand. But it's kind of an interesting concept that could be covered as well. And then if you're going to locate them, just to keep in mind, typically you want to orient them north-south if you can. If it's a standalone structure, you could get away with it of an east-west orientation, but if you're going to do multiple structures, you need to have them north-south, otherwise you'll get shading. If you orient 2 or 3 of them east-west, the southernmost structure will shade everything above it. So if you do put in a structure like that, definitely look to orient them north-south. So with that, I know we're getting close to our end of the thing, so I'm happy to take any questions if folks have them.
Yeah, so if y'all want to unmute yourself, I know at the end there were a few questions on the high tunnels, so I'll let y'all ask them.
Hi, this is Felicia. I have a question for the high tunnels. Are they effective with pest management as well, or in addition to temperature management?
They can be. So there's a couple things. There's a faculty member at Auburn actually that uses like a netting on the side, like a very fine insect net, and it works very well to keep insects out. The high tunnels work for disease management pretty well because you're not getting rain on your crop. And so a lot of our organic farmers use them for that. The negative is that because most of them are not movable, you tend to be growing in the same spot year after year after year. So we can get some soil disease issues. Insect pest wise, they actually work a little bit better for if you're releasing predatory insects, because they tend to kind of hang out in there. The negative is if you have an insect outbreak like whiteflies or something like that, it tends to be much worse in the high tunnels because they also get trapped in there. So I would say overall they do help, but there are some negatives with it too.
Thanks.
And also then, would the high tunnels be good in an urban setting, like possibly on roofs of buildings? Like if there was a restaurant downstairs and they wanted locally grown, they could grow it on the roof of the building?
I think so. You know, structurally, as long as all those things were worked out, they are pretty effective. I visited, I think it was in Fulton County. There was a small group of people that were growing on an old GM plant in the parking lot of it, I think, and actually had high tunnels set up with shade cloth and everything. And it, they actually never removed the parking lot. They just brought a bunch of dirt in on top of it. I will say that pretty much from mid-June to early September, the heat is a problem in high tunnels. And so if I were to use one, I would definitely get some shade cloth.
Okay. And then would it also be a good idea, especially if it was an urban setting, maybe to have a pollinator hive or a beehive to go along with it?
Depending upon what you grow, yes. I will say that honeybees don't mix well with high tunnels.
Okay.
A lot of times they'll get in there and they get disoriented and they fly to the top of the tunnel and they just keep flying against the plastic. But bumblebees work pretty well.
Okay.
And so you can buy little bumblebee hives. You can get them FedExed. They last for about 8 to 10 weeks. They're from copper, and so we've bought them. They have about 80 or 90 bees in them, and you just set them there. There's a little sugar solution in the bottom of the hive that they can feed on. And so bumblebees do work pretty well in the tunnels, and they're more docile.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
I had a question about the seeded watermelon. So I know that seedless watermelon is very popular, but for those of us that do like seeded, like where do they grow that at, or how can we find more information about growing seeded watermelon?
So for seeded, they're a lot easier to grow than seedless. And interestingly, a lot of the varieties that have been around for a long time, like sangria and so forth, they're what our commercial farmers will use for their pollinizers. And so you can actually get a lot of those easily. In terms of production, we have a production guide UGA does. It's pretty long. It's probably 40 pages. And there's probably about 20% of it that you wouldn't want because it's for seedless. But the remainder of it would be applicable to regular seeded melons. And so if you just Google UGA watermelon production, like I said, it's probably more than you need, but you know, it's in PDF and you can scroll through and pull the parts that would be most useful for you. But I will say seeded melons, you can actually direct seed seeded melons and get a decent crop, where seedless watermelons are so finicky, you have to plant transplants because they need temperatures above 85 degrees to germinate. And it's a real, to be honest, it's a pain in the butt to grow them.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question about harvesting melons. So last year was my first year growing melons, and we grew honeydew, cantaloupe, standard watermelons. how do you know when to harvest them? I've heard so many different approaches to this, so I'm interested in your opinion.
Sure. So for cantaloupe, if I was growing them at home, I would harvest them at like half slip or full slip. And so slip is basically when you look at where the stem attaches to the melon. That stem will start cracking and eventually it'll just pop off. But if you look at that stem and about halfway around that stem is cracked, then you can pop that off pretty easily. And that's called half slip. And that's when you would want to harvest them. If you wait to full slip where it just pops right off, a lot of times it'll be too soft. So that's cantaloupes. For watermelons, there's two things they can look for. If you've got the melon there, right immediately adjacent to the melon, there will be the tendril, the little curlicue on the vine, and that should be brown. So that one will be brown next to the melon. That's the first thing. And then you'll want to flip the melon over and make sure that the belly of the melon has some yellowing to it. If it's brown but it's not yellow yet, then it's not quite ready. So you want to have both of those. And even then, sometimes you can get them a little bit too early. And so once both of those happen, I might wait a couple of days. The harvest crews actually will tap the melons and listen to the sound, but I've never been able to get that in like 15 years. I've never been able to get the sound just right. Now honeydews, they're really tricky. They will be in the field at least 2 weeks longer than cantaloupes, if not longer than that. And you want to wait till the fruit gets kind of a creamy color to it. And so it's, start off kind of a white, a really bright, intense white, and then over time it'll start getting kind of a yellowish cream color, and that's what you want to shoot for. But honeydews are very hard to get right, and in Georgia, honestly, commercially, a lot of times it is rot on the vine because they have to be out there so much longer than cantaloupes that we have a hard time getting them.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
I have a question about the cole crop, specifically cauliflower. I have been trying to grow some cauliflower and like save the seed and have a whole process. And the cauliflower, it was a purple cauliflower, and it grew in, but never actually formed a crown. It was like had one long stalk and a tiny crown, and one long stalk and a tiny crown. Is that indicative of some like nutritional deficiency, or is it like weather? What does that tell me about the growing practices?
So if you just got a few kind of stalks that came off with little tiny crowns, usually something happened to the growing point. It could have been weather damage, could have even been insect damage, but when you have 2 or 3 of those shoots come out, it means at some point that growing point was damaged or could have died. And so those are kind of axillary shoots coming out. And so it could be a variety of different things. So could be weather related if we had like a freeze damage, could be insect related. Sometimes in an extreme nutrient deficiency, we can see some of that, but usually the plant itself won't look very good. So if you had a good looking plant, it was probably just something that got in and killed the growing point of it.
I actually had another question about saving seeds for cole crops. So when they bolt and they make those little bean pod thingies, when when is the seed mature enough to pick and save?
So basically, if you're going to save them, you want to wait until those pods start turning brown, so that they're dry. But you've got a fairly short window from when they turn brown to when they start shattering and dropping all over the ground. So you definitely want to wait till they're mature and they're just starting to dry out. But if you're concerned about them splitting, once they start turning kind of a light to medium brown color, then you can cut the stalk and let them finish drying. You know, you can cut the stalk and stick it in like a paper bag and let them finish drying out in there, so that you don't lose them all on the ground and stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you so much for presenting to us today. And I love the things that you've got for the genetic study. That's just.
If there's any math folks in the audience, this is Romanesco cauliflower. And actually, when I was in school, I had a buddy that did a paper on this with like fractals and repeating patterns. And Romanesco cauliflower is a bunch of fractals. So anyway, that's another oddity that you can kind of throw in there. Stuff. So.
Also, you probably could use it for Fibonacci's code, because it kind of.
Yeah. And it's a lot of people. I don't know. I don't really like the taste of it. I think it's okay, but yeah.
I'm sorry, I did have one other question for tomato production. Given it's such a big crop in Georgia, are there, or have you ever seen in your experience issues with widespread, like curly top having impact on the crops from the leafhoppers?
We haven't had a lot of problems with curly top in tomato, but our biggest two issues in the spring, tomato spotted wilt virus that's spread by thrips, is an issue. And then more recently in the fall, tomato yellow leaf curl virus that's spread by whiteflies. 3 years ago, we lost probably 85% of our tomato crop in the fall to that virus. There is resistance now, and everyone grows resistant varieties now commercially. But those two viruses pretty much determine what you're going to grow commercially, especially the yellow leaf curl in the fall. There's about 6 or 8 varieties with resistance, and it doesn't matter if there's another variety that tastes 10 times better, they're not going to grow it because of the virus.
I actually had a question about Brussels sprouts.
Sure.
So when you top a Brussels sprout, does that mean you're cutting off that big cabbagey head up top?
Pretty much. So, you know, if you're, let's say your stalk is maybe 2.5 feet tall. And so you're basically just taking the apical meristem out of the top of that. So you're cutting it, you know, 2 or 3 inches from the very top of the plant and taking it out. And it spurs the plant to have more side shoots and help those sprouts kind of be more uniform.
Okay. And then a question about potatoes. Can you, is there a way to start those in the fall, or does it get too cold too fast? Like, can you do like a second crop in the fall?
You could, if you planted in kind of mid to late September, and then if we had a late freeze, you could probably get them out in early December. And so some years you would probably get nailed with the hard freeze and couldn't do it. But then other years, you know, if it was pretty mild fall, you probably could get something out of it.
Okay.
It'd be a little risky, but you know, you could probably do it, you know, about half the time.
Okay.
Okay, well, we are going to wrap this up, and so we can get some food and start with our second session at 12:30. And I'll have some announcements at that time about the final exam and some of the questions y'all had asked earlier. So, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. Very informational. I enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else did too. So,
Well, happy to be here. Have a good Friday afternoon too.
Thanks. And
Thank you so
I guess you'll just send us the PowerPoint, or send me the PowerPoint. Okay.
Yeah, I can. If I do a PDF, would you want like 2 slides per page or multiple slides per page? Or?
Probably a couple slides per page would be good.
Okay. All right. I'll do